What's the story of your breakdown? When viewers email me, there tends to be three common factors that actually sort of led up to the breakdown in the period sort of immediately leading up to the breakdown. Firstly, there often is some kind of an issue at work. It might be a shock redundancy, a shock sacking, it might be some areas of bullying at work. Secondly, something tends to have happened in close personal relationships, whether that's the end of a relationship, whether it's the betrayal of a friendship. And thirdly, and possibly most importantly of all, there tends to have been some kind of unhealed or unresolved childhood trauma. In my most recent video on navigating loneliness, and the link for that will be below, a viewer asked me what my story, the story was of my breakdown. They said that they couldn't seem to find it in any of my videos. And to start with, I was a little bit surprised because I felt like I sort of talked about my story pretty much all the time in my videos as I share my experience. But then I realized that often what I do is I'll talk about the emotions that I've experienced as a result of my breakdown. And I might hint at certain traumas that led to the breakdown without actually explaining what those experiences were. So in today's video, I'm going to share with you the story of my breakdown, the traumas that led to it, and they span a period of 300 years. I'll then share with you how I worked with these traumas in order to heal, transform, understand, comprehend and release them so that I could move beyond the trauma and the breakdown and rebuild a flourishing life for myself. And then I'll outline a tool for you that you can use to track the events that led up to your breakdown in a way that will help you to understand them, comprehend them, and also work out your next natural steps towards moving away from them, healing them, transforming them, and rebuilding your own flourishing life. So come into the Spirit Spa Sanctuary with me today, where we examine the story of the breakdown. So I'm Karen Packwood, and this is the Spirit Spa, an online sanctuary dedicated to supporting you if you're in the early stages of recovering from a nervous breakdown, helping you to understand why the breakdown happened to you so that you can work out your next natural steps towards rebuilding a flourishing life for yourself. As I tell you the story of my breakdown, we're going to start just on the cusp of my breakdown, and I'm actually then going to take you back in time. As I said in my introduction, we're actually going on a journey back in time to about 300 years ago. But we'll start about 20 years ago, which is when I actually had my breakdown. And so what happened in terms of my breakdown was, just like many of you, the time leading up to my breakdown was a very difficult time. My daughter had been born prematurely, 3 months prematurely, and so I had had 4 months with her in the neonatal intensive care unit, obviously incredibly concerned for her welfare and also her survival. As you can imagine, this was an extremely traumatic time for me. However, it was compounded by the fact that her father had decided to leave me in the first weeks of my pregnancy. He decided that he didn't want to be with me, didn't want to have anything to do with the pregnancy, and actually basically informed me that he'd been seeing somebody else and that he wanted to be with that person. So there I was in the neonatal intensive care unit, alone, terrified for my daughter's survival, and just completely overwhelmed with the trauma of it all. This experience was further compounded by the financial difficulties that came with having a 4-month period of my child being in hospital. Obviously I wanted to be with her at the hospital all day to make sure that she was okay and to bond with her and so on, which actually meant that I didn't work at that period of time. And so consequently, my financial life started to suffer. It became difficult to pay bills and the mortgage and so on. So there were lots and lots and lots of sort of financial difficulties and financial strains that came along. And in hindsight, I can understand why somebody might say, well, why didn't you just go back to work? But at the time, my whole attention was on my daughter's survival and my daughter's welfare, and that was all that mattered to me. I really wasn't thinking sensibly about sort of other things such as managing finances. So yeah, I got into a lot of financial stress, a lot of financial difficulties. And I think it was those financial difficulties that were probably the straw that broke the camel's back. I was able to keep myself quite strong and quite stoic for my daughter while she was in hospital. And then when she came out of hospital, it was almost as if like the world sort of hit me in the face again. And there were, lots of bills, letters from people sort of demanding bills to be paid. I think the one that was most difficult was a credit card company phone call, where the woman was just giving me such a difficult time because I'd gone £64 over my credit card limit. I mean, £64, and seriously, she almost took me over to the edge because she was so hostile to me at a point when I was incredibly vulnerable. Now, by this time, when my daughter came out of hospital, I went back to work. I was a teacher and I went back to work on a part-time basis. And so I was now juggling being a single parent to a very young baby, and also being a teacher and all of the responsibilities that come with that job as well. And I sort of juggled along for a couple of years, combining single motherhood to a very young and sort of vulnerable baby, and also being a teacher. And then, like many people, my breakdown came out of the blue. I thought that I was managing things. I thought that I was on top of stuff. I actually didn't realise that there was anything wrong with me. I genuinely did not know there was anything wrong with me until one night something happened. I'm not entirely sure what time of year it was, but I think it was around February time. And I'd put my daughter to bed, and I'd gone through all the normal routines and rituals with her bedtime, snuggling down and reading her bedtime story. Our cat had sort of jumped on the bed and snuggled up with us, and she had fallen asleep. I also fell asleep, which wasn't unusual in those days. As you can imagine, I was absolutely exhausted. And so I fell asleep with her at about 7:30 in the evening. And then, in the middle of the night, I woke up and I had this strong sense of the room being completely full of peace. That's the only way I can describe it. It just felt like the room was full of peace. And I sat up on her bed and I just heard these words. I don't know where these words came from, whether they were in me, outside of me, but I just heard these words: "You must give up your job." And I knew without a shadow of a doubt that I had to give up my job. I didn't know why. I didn't know what that meant for me, but I knew that I had to follow that guidance. Now that only lasted for a very few minutes, and then immediately after that I just snuggled back down with my daughter and went back to sleep. In the morning I got up completely normally. I phoned work and I called in sick. I got my daughter ready for nursery and I took her to nursery. And all I can say, it was like I was in a state of, automatic process, automatic action. I felt completely normal, and yet I also knew that I wasn't normal, my normal state. I took my daughter to nursery. Everything was fine and normal. I waved her goodbye from the window, as I always did, making silly monkey gestures and pretending to be an elephant with a long trunk dancing around. Got back in the car and drove home. When I got home, I put the car in the drive, and then just as I got to the back door, there was a sensation in my body as if everything cracked. If you imagine like a cartoon egg, that somebody taps the top of the egg and then it goes, and just cracks all over. It was like that. It was this internal cracking, this internal shattering. And I remember kind of knowing, oh, I'm broken, I am breaking, I've broken. And then I remember feeling absolutely terrified to take a breath. I had this sense that if I took a breath, it might be like a breath too much. It might be the breath that might actually cause the final shattering, the last sort of, the last shattering in within me. And I was very frightened. I remember being really frightened of taking a breath. And then I remember very little else for the next 6 months. For the next 6 months, I spent most of the time in bed, fast asleep. I remember being sort of very conscious about making sure that I was there for my daughter in the mornings and in the evenings, before nursery and after nursery. But I don't actually remember whether I was doing that in those 6 months as well, or whether a relative was doing that for me, because I actually was so poorly that I ended up having to move in with a relative to care for me. And so I don't know whether in those 6 months I took my daughter to nursery or not. I can't remember. I'd like to think that I did, but I can't remember. What I do remember is the end of that 6-month period, when I woke up and I was in a semi-conscious state. My eyes were still closed, and it was like the first time I'd been aware of my body since the day when I had completely shattered. And I remember my sort of first awareness of my body was around my legs, and having this really strong sense that my legs were paralysed, that I just couldn't move them. And I remember the weight of the duvet on my legs and this kind of terror of, oh my gosh, what has happened to me, and how am I going to kind of get myself through this situation. And while I lay there in that semi-conscious state, I remember having this thought, and the thought was, if this has happened to me, there's got to be a reason for it, and I will find the reason for it. I'll make sense of why this has happened, and I'll find my way through this. I've always been somebody who, if something difficult happens to me, I always try to believe that it's happened for a reason, and that I'm going to learn from it, grow from it, and evolve my life for the better from it. And also hopefully bring some good into the world because of it. And this situation was no different. I just woke up with this kind of instinct of, why ever this has happened, I'm going to find the good in it. I'm going to find the positive in it. So that's the immediate aftermath of the moment that sort of the breakdown impacted me. So many of the videos on this channel sort of follow on from that moment when I woke up, and very much relate to my process of healing and recovery after that 6-month period. But what we're going to do in today's video is I'm going to take you back in time, and I'm going to take you back before the time of my daughter's birth and the trauma of that, back before the time of my daughter's father saying that he didn't want to have anything to do with parenting with me. So I'm taking us back before that, and I'm going to take us back to my childhood. And one of the experiences that happened in my childhood that I believe had a very, very significant impact on me having a breakdown later in life. So we're going back to when I was 12 years old. My family and I had just moved from an area of Britain where we were very happy, and we'd literally just moved to a new area. I'd literally just started a new school. I didn't know anybody, I didn't have any friends in the area. We were all just sort of in the process of settling in. And then one day I came home to find my mother in the hallway with some suitcases. And to cut a very long story short, she was in the process of leaving my father and myself. And that's what she did. I watched as her car drove away, and then, as you can imagine, my life shattered. But actually, what happened was that I think I really fell apart on the I did. I fell apart on the inside. I remember standing by a lamppost just after she had left, and like having this similar sensation of shattering that I explained to you on the morning when I had my breakdown. And I think the thing is that when I was 12 and it happened to me, I remember there were a few seconds where I was really full of rage to my mother. And it was almost like then it all kind of like turned round and imploded into myself, and I sort of took on this self-hatred and self-loathing. You know, to be left by your mother, you must be a pretty hateful person, mustn't you? So I literally really swallowed this belief that I was just such a really terrible person, that really didn't deserve to be liked or loved by anybody, because if you know, being abandoned by your mother, you're not a likable or lovable person. So that was a massive trauma in my life. And as you can imagine, I didn't have any friends. I was so ashamed. I didn't actually tell anybody anyway, because, you know, to tell somebody that had happened to me was, you know, like really having to admit the shame and the horror and the belief and reality that I was obviously this really awful person. So I think I really swallowed it, and I just kind of, as you do, had to get on with life. You know, I just went to school and just got on with school, and I guess threw myself into my schoolwork, and there was a lot of grief, there was a lot of sorrow, there was a lot of heartache, but that didn't go anywhere other than like inside me. It just stayed in me. And as I think about it now, and I've done all the work that I've had to do in healing my breakdown, obviously there has been a huge amount of work that I've had to do around healing the sorrow, the shame, the agony, the rage, the despair in those seconds and moments when I realised that my mother was leaving me, and then also had to watch her driving away from me. So without dwelling on that for too much, I think that gives you a flavour of quite a major childhood trauma that contributed to my breakdown, because I hadn't processed it at the time. So let's go back before that. Let's rewind time even more. So that was when I was 12. But let's go back to my birth. If you've watched my Navigating Loneliness video, you'll know that I talk about the loop of loneliness that I have in terms of my thoughts and feelings when loneliness hits me. And it's phrases like, nobody loves me, nobody cares for me, nobody's there for me, nobody's supporting me. And in that video, I talked about how if we wanted to, we could examine the roots of those feelings. And I didn't actually go into that in a lot of detail in that video, but what I will do now is actually explain where I think those thoughts and feelings come from. So, my birth. I was born, like my daughter, prematurely. Like my daughter, I also only weighed 2 pounds. Like my daughter, I was whisked away from my mother at birth into the neonatal intensive care unit. However, with my daughter, I was allowed to hold her quite soon. It wasn't immediately, but within the first few hours of life, I was able to hold her and snuggle up to her. And we know now the importance of a mother holding her baby as soon as possible after birth in order to create the maternal and child bond. For my mother, back in the 60s, this was not the case. I was actually in the neonatal unit for 3 weeks, and for the entire time, my mother was not allowed to hold me. She wasn't even allowed to go into the neonatal intensive care ward. The only way that she could see me was for a nurse to hold me up at a portal window so that she could just see me through this window. She wasn't allowed to touch me, hold me, kiss me, caress me, or anything. So it's not difficult to work out where perhaps my loop of loneliness thoughts come from. Nobody loves me, nobody likes me, nobody cares for me, nobody reaches out for me, nobody holds me. Those thoughts that really haunt me when loneliness is kicking in for me, it's so easy to see how they can come right from that birth experience. And it's also interesting to notice the patterns that are being repeated. My daughter born prematurely, me born prematurely. But there's another pattern that was repeated. Just as my daughter's father chose to have nothing to do with me, my pregnancy, and wanted me to be both a mother and a father to my daughter, my mother's father also abandoned her, and she grew up without her father. Can you see how that pattern is being repeated? And this, for me, is where trauma healing and trauma recovery begins to get really interesting. As part of my PhD research, where I've had to do an awful lot of research into trauma theory, literary trauma theory, around, for those of you that don't know, my PhD is focusing on trauma-based life writing, and I'm writing a memoir. So a lot of my research has been around trauma theories. And there's one particular trauma theory by 2 French psychiatrists, which has really appealed to me during my research. And their research, they're 2 French psychiatrists, and so they've done an awful lot of work with people who've got mental health issues that have actually caused them to actually be admitted into hospitals. And one of the things that they discovered was that if they actually started to ask their patients about the experiences of their grandparents, they began to unlock the trauma that their patient was carrying. And their theory is that the grandparents, many of whom at this point in time were people who would have been living in France during the Second World War, and so would have experienced a lot of trauma at that point in time, particularly out in small villages and so on and so forth. And a lot of those experiences, as with many people who went through the First and Second World War, those experiences were never spoken about. The grandparents just, silenced themselves and either couldn't speak about them or wouldn't speak about them or had no space to speak about them. And so these two psychiatrists, their theory is that what happens is that trauma gets passed on to the grandchildren, and the grandchildren carry it as mental health issues, emotional issues, and so on. And actually what helps them is that to get themselves back to a state of wellness is if they actually begin to unpick the stories of the grandparents. So this really began to interest me. In order to look at trauma, we need to look at the stories of the grandparents. But of course, if we're looking at the story of one set of grandparents, if the theory is right, then we also have to look at their grandparents' stories, and so on and so on and so on, looking at the stories of the grandparents to see what traumas they've experienced, what traumas they haven't healed, what traumas they haven't spoken about, and how those have passed down generationally to their grandchildren and so on. Now, as it happens, my mother is an absolute expert on family history research. So she had loads of information that she could tell me about various lines of the family, where they lived, what work they did, what their marriages were like, how many children they had. Often, obviously, as we go back in time, the deaths that had happened in the families with children and so on. So she just knew so much information, and she was able to give me a huge amount of information. However, there was one side of the family that she had done absolutely no research on. I wonder if you can guess which line of the family it was. Did you guess right? Her father's line. Because she had so little respect for her father's abandonment of her, and actually, can I just add, not only her abandonment of her, but also her abandonment of me. He chose not to acknowledge us, never. She wrote to say that I had been born, but he chose not to acknowledge that at all. So there's a continuation of abandonment there as well. And so she had decided that she had so little disrespect for him, she didn't want to put any time or energy into doing the research into that family line. Now, of course, it's not going to surprise you that that's where that line is where all the answers were. So I actually started to do some research into this grandfather, working on the premise that if there was some unresolved trauma of his that perhaps had been passed down to me, then maybe it'd be really good for me to know a little bit about his life and to find out what those traumas might be. And that led to such an interesting world of knowledge, actually, because then what happened was I discovered that he had been a prisoner of war. Aged 17, 18, he was taken as a prisoner of war. He was in various prisoner of war camps in Italy. But then he was also, for the majority of the war, he was a prisoner of war in the Lansdorf camp, which is very close to where Auschwitz is. And in fact, many of the inmates from Lansdorf actually were forced to actually build Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. It's a notorious camp if you do any research into it, particularly for the Russian prisoners. It was an absolutely horrific camp. I won't go into that in too much detail now, but just to say that he was, a prisoner of war there. But then what happened was that he became part of the whole era of what were known as the Long Marches or the Death Marches. So these marches took place in one of the worst winters on record in Europe. Absolutely freezing conditions, below freezing conditions, deep snow, blizzards, and the prisoners were forced to walk thousands of miles over several months away from their prison camps. And en route thousands and thousands and thousands of men died. They would just, obviously from starvation, from hunger, they would just collapse and they would just be left to die on the roadside. So you can imagine that for this 18-year-old young boy, 18 to 20-year-old young boy by the time at this point in the war, it's very hard for us to imagine the trauma of that experience. And he never spoke of it. We know now because of contact that we've had with other relatives that he never spoke about it. I only know about it because of the research that I've done into what happened with those particular prisoners. And in terms of patterns being passed down and so on, and I just think it's very interesting that one of the major tools that I have used to help me heal my trauma is walking, being out in nature, but walking. And those of you that have watched any of my videos where I talk about what happened after those 6 months, where I was just completely out of it for 6 months, it was actually walking that I used as my primary tool of healing. And I won't say too much about that now because I do talk about that in other videos and I can come back to it at another point. But I just think it's really fascinating that this grandfather was forced to take part in this absolutely horrific walk. And I should just say that it wasn't the only time during his prisoner of war experience. There was a point when he was in Italy where he was marched from Italy to Germany, which was also a journey of several weeks or months over several hundred miles. So traumatic walking had been a really big part of his life that he didn't talk about. And yet when I came to need to do some healing, it was walking that I used to help myself. I just think that's quite interesting. I could say lots more about that, but that's not what the focus is of this video. So we have this grandfather that has left, he's walked away, he's abandoned my mother and my grandmother. But then this got me really intrigued, if we're following this, the trauma of the grandparents being passed down to the grandchildren, well, what about his grandparents? I wanted to know, what was their experience? What were the patterns for them? Were there patterns of abandonment? What were the trauma patterns in their lives that perhaps they didn't talk about, couldn't talk about, wouldn't talk about, didn't have the space to talk about? But what patterns were going on in their lives in relation to trauma and abandonment that perhaps had been passed down to my grandfather and so on down to my mother and so on? So what were those patterns? So now we go back even further in time and we go back to Wales. So my ancestry is Welsh. Both of my grandfathers are Welsh. One of them is from Port Talbot in South Wales, and the other one was from the Merthyr Tydfil area, which if any of you know about Wales and the Merthyr Tydfil area, you'll know that during the Industrial Revolution, this was the major area of the coal mines, the tin mines and the iron works of the Industrial Revolution. The hillsides, the mountainsides were completely ravaged with this industrial life. Now this for me is where it becomes even more interesting. With the help of my mother and her absolute expertise at family research, we were able to go back in time to look at these ancestors that lived and worked in the coalfields. And what we found was so much trauma and so many experiences of young children in families being left by a parent. But they weren't being left because the parent had necessarily walked away from the family and abandoned the family. What had happened was that the families had been left was because the father was killed in pit accidents. And we traced 3 generations of my great-grandfathers, I think it's my 3, 4 and 5 times great-grandfathers, were all killed in pit accidents, all leaving a wife with young children. Now, as soon as I saw that, it was almost as if some kind of light went on for me, because I suddenly had this kind of understanding that these patterns of loss and children being left in a family with just one parent, that seems to have kind of, sort of travelled down my mother's lineage, kind of comes from these really tragic experiences in the coal mines. And it made me think about unconscious conditioning, and it made me think about how we act things out sometimes from an unconscious place, and we don't know what drives us to sort of carry out certain actions and certain behaviours, certain thoughts and certain feelings. And I sort of just had this very strong sense that my mother walking away from me wasn't about me. Almost it wasn't about her. It was almost just like some kind of generational impulse to leave, to go. This pattern of children being left alone with one parent. The trauma of a grief and a loss. And if we kind of go back in time, we just look at these patterns of separations, these patterns of losses, these patterns of children being left with just one parent, that one parent being left to have to cope in those very difficult and traumatic situations. And suddenly it all made sense. I could just see these patterns being repeated down through the family. And I think it was in that moment, once I had that kind of understanding, the wider understanding of family patterns, that I kind of was able to come to a place of acceptance and compassion for my mother's actions. It suddenly became like it wasn't quite so personal, and that we were both part of a much bigger ancestral patterning, if you like, and we talked about it. And obviously we don't know whether that's right or wrong, but it just felt very right for me. And in a way it didn't matter whether it's right or wrong. The point is that it helped me release some suffering. It helped me release some pain. It helped me feel like I'd got some kind of understanding of what had been going on at an unconscious level for me with my mother and in the family on a wider scale. So I was able to come to a place of deep compassion, deep acceptance. It didn't mean to say that I wasn't still cross and angry about what my mother did to me, of course. I don't know whether I'll ever kind of get through that, really. But it softened it, it's eased it, it's enabled me to go to places of grief and sadness and anger and allow myself to have those experiences, but also come to them from a place of compassion and love for myself, for my daughter, for my mother, and for our ancestors as well. It was almost as if I came to a place of grieving for all of the ancestors, for all of what the ancestors had experienced. Now, of course, they would have had their own grieving as well, but it was almost as if I was doing another wave of grieving for the generations that have come before, but also clearing a way for the generations to come as well. I just had this sort of sense that I was doing this work for myself, for the ancestors, and also descendants to come. It was like a sort of clearing a pathway, if you like, of releasing unspoken and unhealed trauma within my family. So where did that leave me? Well, it left me in a really great place, because I suddenly had this knowledge, wisdom. I didn't have these nagging questions of why. I had some answers as to why this had happened to me in my family. The really beautiful thing was that I was able to go and visit their graves in Wales as well and pay my respects to these ancestors, and their graves are on the top of this incredibly beautiful mountain, just looking over into the Brecon Beacons and the Black Mountains and just this beautiful vast mountainous area of Wales, and to pay my respects and to thank them, but also to give the trauma back to them as well, and to say thank you for the guidance, thank you for the wisdom, thank you for the healing, but we can leave it here now in the past. We don't need to take it forward. We don't need to have this within the family now, and we certainly don't need it in the family for the generations to come. And that was an incredibly moving experience for me, to be able to have that connection with those ancestors. And the process of working on that research with my mother became a very sort of healing experience for us both. It's something that we're both interested in, it's something that we were both very curious about, it was something that we were both very fascinated about as we found out the answers to certain things and began to make sense of things and allow things to click into place for us. So it was a very sort of cathartic and healing process for us both as well, which I think we both appreciated. So how can me sharing this information about my story of my breakdown help you come to an understanding of your breakdown and why it might have happened, so that you can then actually begin to work out your next natural steps towards healing and rebuilding a flourishing life for yourself? Well, obviously what I'm hoping is that by seeing sort of like the bigger picture of my family story, it helps you begin to sort of think about your wider family story, your generational history, your generational patterns. And that research from those French psychiatrists around, what is the unspoken, the unspeakable, the silent trauma of the ancestors that has been passed down to you, that you are somehow in the process of healing. So I have an invitation for you as something that might help you begin the process of working out the story of your breakdown and the sort of the wider, broader and historical generational patterns that might have led to it. So this is a very high-tech process. All you need is a piece of paper and a pen. And then what you're going to do is you're going to create a very rough sketch of a timeline of your life from your breakdown, as much as you can, going back in time to all of the events leading up to your breakdown. And as you can see on this piece of paper, I've just done a very rough sketch of my sort of history that has led to my breakdown. There that I've talking about my daughter's premature birth, her father abandoning us, and then my mother leaving, my premature birth, my mother's father leaving, into the war experiences, and then back into the miners in Wales. Now, of course, I could do that in much more detail, and obviously I have over the last few years been working with that in a lot more detail, but it's a rough sketch to get you started so that you yourself can also begin to go into this family history in a lot more detail. And you'll see that what I've done on the right hand side of where I have actually listed the actual life experience, I've also broken down the emotions that I was feeling at that point in time. Now that can be really helpful because it can really begin to help you work out what are the traumatic emotions and feelings that you're carrying around that you can begin to heal and transform. Just here, in very scruffy scribble, you can see that I've written patterns of breakdown. Now, what that means is that what happened is that as I was doing this particular
research, I actually discovered that I wasn't the first person in my
to actually have a breakdown. My father had a breakdown, my mother had a breakdown, my grandmother had a breakdown, and my grandfather had a breakdown. So there's kind of like there's a history of breakdowns in the family as well, which isn't surprising when you know about the history of the trauma in the family as well. So it's quite interesting to look for those patterns as well. So if it feels right for you, why not just take some time to see if you can begin to create a timeline of your breakdown, moving backwards in time, looking at it from that sort of very sort of self-focused lens, but then actually pulling the lens out to look at it from a family and historical lens too. It's also really helpful to look at it from a societal lens too. I mean, like what actually was going on for the family at around the time when they were experiencing any of the traumas that they were experiencing, and war is an obvious example of that. I'm also aware that not everybody is going to have a family research expert in their family, as I have. So what do you do then if you actually don't know about your family, if you don't know the historical, the history of your family? So my encouragement is to just go back as far as you can, and it doesn't matter if it's just one generation to your parents' generation. Just write down everything that you know and just really begin to dig into that, sort of journal on it. You can ask yourself about what feelings come up for you about it. Another thing that you can do is actually also spend some time writing about what it feels like to not know. Because I think if you write about that and you explore the emotions about that, that also gives you an insight to some of the trauma that you're feeling about the not knowing. Look at the emotions that not knowing is triggering for you, and know that they are some of the, in terms of your next natural steps towards healing, there's some of the emotions that you can begin to explore and think about in relation to understanding them, releasing them, feeling all of the emotions that you feel around those emotions, and then moving on from there. And even if you don't know about your actual family, you might know about where your family came from. You might know a little bit about perhaps the town that they lived in. You might know of a general county. You might know of a country. And maybe that's what you can begin to connect in with as well. I mean, what was going on in those locations historically at certain times? How might that have impacted your family, your history? Can you see any ways in which perhaps something that was going on societally, historically within a particular area might have had some kind of an impact on your life experience? It's something to think about. I'm not saying that that's right, but I'm saying it's something to think about and to explore, to become interested in, to just see, can you make sense societally, historically, of your breakdown? As you take your time to work on this timeline, or the story of the journey of writing your story of your breakdown, please take your time with it. This is, treat it as if it were a sacred activity. Find time where you can really nurture yourself, where you can care for yourself. And it's really important that afterwards you do take some time to nourish yourself. This is emotional work. It isn't work that's like, you're not writing a shopping list. You're writing about deeply emotional, personal and traumatic experiences that have, it will bring up emotions in you. There's nothing wrong with those emotions coming up, as long as you give yourself time to process them and care for them. That you know that if there is an emotion that's going to be particularly difficult for you, that you've thought about how you're going to care for yourself if that happens. Who have you got to support you? What activities, what healing tools have you got to support you? So that you're thinking about the full package of self-care and self-support as you come into this. And if you are somebody who works with therapists or works with your GP in relation to your nervous breakdown recovery, then maybe maybe tell them that you're actually taking part in that activity, so that they can help you and support you in that process, and they might be able to help you kind of really gain some further insights into the history of your breakdown, the causes of your breakdown, and your natural steps towards healing from your breakdown. But please remember, self-care, self-nourishment, self-love at all times in this process. So I'm Karen Packwood, and this is the Spirit Spa, an online sanctuary dedicated to supporting you if you're in the early stages of recovering from a nervous breakdown, helping you to understand why the breakdown happened to you, so that you can work out your next natural steps towards rebuilding a flourishing life for yourself. If you have any further questions that you would like to ask me about your recovery from your breakdown, please leave them in the comments box below, or email me at karen@karenpackwood.com or karenpackwood@gmail.com, and I will be very happy to create a video response for you. So as we come to the end of today's video, first of all, I'd like to thank you so much for being here with me, listening to my story. It takes courage to share our stories of trauma. So thank you for for listening to my story and hearing my story. And as you have been working on your story, as ever, I want you to think about the question that I always encourage you to ask as you're supporting yourself through your healing recovery, and that is, if I was to love myself today, what would I do? And I am wishing you a very peaceful day.